Hi, Miss Lisa here. I'm a speech and language therapist and had a really great question from a parent yesterday who is staying at home with her little one and working on speech. She wanted to know how to choose sounds to practice. So of course we have some goals and some sounds that we've been practicing at school, but when we're at home, sometimes it's hard to know which words to correct or which sounds to practice with our kids when they're having some challenges or delays in learning their speech skills. So I thought this was such a great question that maybe other parents might be wondering this right now as well, staying at home with their kids, not having as much access to therapies and school services. So I'm gonna try to answer that question in a nice, concise way so that you can all think about this at home while you're practicing speech. So the first thing that I wanted to tell you about is how, as speech therapists, we think about which sounds develop earlier and which sounds develop later. So earlier developing sounds would be sounds like p, b, t, d, n, h, w, and y. Those would be the consonant sounds that we would consider earlier developing sounds. So when I'm thinking about choosing sounds to work on with kids, I might think, are they still learning those earlier developing sounds, or have they mastered most of those early sounds and are ready to move on to some of the later developing sounds, which would be consonant sounds like k, g, f, v, o, s, z, sh, ch, j, and of course some of our consonant blends. Things like sk at the beginning of a word like sky, or gr at the beginning of a word like green. Those would be later developing sound targets that we would move on to in most cases once a child has mastered some of those earlier developing sounds and learned how to sequence them with the vowels in simple words. That's one way that we think about speech related to how it develops typically in kids who maybe don't have any challenges or extra difficulties learning their speech sounds. Another thing that we think about when we're choosing target sounds to work on with kids is how easy it is for them to imitate that sound. We use a word called stimulability to talk about that. So if I were to say a sound or a word to your child, how easy would it be for them to imitate that sound and those movements that they have to make to be able to make that sound clearly? So even if a child hasn't mastered all those early developing sounds, but it's quite easy for them to imitate a later developing sound like f or z, we might choose to work on that sound because they're ready to practice that sound. They don't need as much support to be successful in imitating that. So if you're at home and you notice that a sound is quite easy for your child to imitate when you're reading a story or modeling a word for them that they might have had trouble saying for you, that's a good indication that your child is probably ready to practice that sound or that word. If it's really, really tricky and you've given it 2 or 3 tries and they're just still not getting that sound, whether it's one of those earlier developing sounds or later developing sounds, we still might go ahead and take a step back on that sound. May not be ready to practice that sound if it's just really, really tricky and they're not having success with that, and that's always okay. We can come back to that later when they do have more readiness or stimulability to work on imitating that sound. And the last thing I wanted to add is just thinking about the level of practice that you're modeling or asking of your child. So it's completely fine to practice those sounds all on their own. That's a little bit easier than sequencing them into words, and that still gives kids lots of good practice with those motor movements, building up their awareness and control of a sound like k or n or sh just by itself. And the way that I like to do that is usually reading a book or playing a game or with toys and then finding a word with that sound and just taking it out of the word. So I might read a book and say, oh, what sound do you hear at the beginning of the word shoe? I hear the sh sound. Let's say that sound together. So then we would practice the sound and not have pressure to sequence that sound just yet into a word, which might be more difficult. If you find, again, that your child is ready for saying those words and sequencing those sounds, then of course, go ahead and practice those. Sometimes I ask for, tell it to me 3 times. Can we get shoe, shoe, shoe? Just to get that extra repetition, almost like going to the gym. So those are some tips for practicing speech at home. I hope that that can help you and that everybody's staying safe and healthy, and you'll come and see me again. Bye.